back to balancing profit with the planet and the people. That means it is no longer just about the number on the bottom line of your financial statements. It is also about the social aspects, what we give to the people, as well as taking care of our planet, making sure that we are using or maintaining or managing our resources sustainably. And when you break it down into the little components, that's where the E, S, and G factors come in, right? And when we start on environmental factors, as mentioned, this is one of the key areas that most people would think about when they use the term ESG, and that is the impact that we have on the environment today. And I'm quite sure for many of you, the first thing that comes to mind is climate change, right? Things about emissions, the rising temperatures. A lot of our emissions are already baked in till 2050. So in terms of the physical aspects, we will experience more extreme weather, heat waves, things like that. But in terms of the transition aspect, that means moving into cleaner energy, technological developments, legal changes, or regulatory changes. These are areas that are also very relevant when we think about the E aspect, right? Top of mind issue for most of our businesses, 58% of Asian businesses say that they see more E issues than S or G issues. And there are also other considerations when we think about environment. It's not just about climate change, it's about resource management, it's also about pollution management, waste management, and more recently, if you've been keeping up with the latest regulations, TNFD, so nature-related risks. And the important thing about this is that you have to bring the different concepts together. Remember I talked about interconnectivity, right? A single physical or transition risk from climate change can have a lot of varying impacts on the rest of the 5 areas that you see on this page. That means, let's say, extreme heat waves. It's not just about disrupting the business. It's also about the well-being of individuals, right? People find it too hot to work. In some countries or in some cities, there is a hard cap on what temperature you must work within. Any temperature above, let's say, 38 degrees Celsius, all work, outdoor work must stop. So it is it's a web of connected risks and areas that should be heavily considered. And then we go into the social aspect. So this is the one where probably about 10% of the room raised their hands. And I like to say that S is like the heart and the soul of the organization. No longer just about the financial figures, but what we can give back to society, right? And the idea underpinning social aspects is stakeholders. Who are your stakeholders? It will be critical in terms of how you design the ESG strategy. So for risk practitioners, what does this mean? This means that beyond just the traditional assessment, when we look at likelihood of risk or impact of risk, we also need to consider for who we are doing this for. It's not just for investors. Previously, 30, 40 years ago, yes, it's for investors. But for today, we need to consider who our key suppliers are, key customers. We have to look at who our other important stakeholders are, employees as well, governments, media, activists. So the list can go on and on and on. And only when we have an understanding of who these people are, then we can design our strategy as risk practitioners properly. If you have noticed, when you open a sustainability report, 80% of the time, what's the first few topics that will come up? Stakeholder management. Then the next topic is materiality assessment. That's how important it is when we are looking at S-related issues. So I think for the many issues under this category, you will definitely be familiar with at least more than half of them, I would say. Things like diversity, community involvement, training, awareness, fairness and equality for all. And these are very important topics within organizations we work with today. And then governance. Governance is the key that brings everything together. For people who are in risk functions, who raised their hand just now, you probably would have thought of governance as your first area when it comes to mind. And that's because governance is something that we already practice when we do ERM within the organization. when you oversee or you manage cybersecurity risks, health and safety risks. All these sorts of risks will involve some form of governance. So it is being practiced, things that we already know. And if we stretch it out, you can also consider the environmental and the social aspects as well. So just because it's a climate-related risk doesn't mean it has to sit within the E category. It also has to be considered from the S and the G perspectives as well, right? So a lot of new topics and words, and if you've been Googling ESG, you will have seen an alphabet soup, right? TCFD, TNFD, SASB, IFRS, ABCD, EFG, all of these pretty much exist within the realm of sustainability today. And compliance and regulatory sectors are beginning to see that, and they are starting to simplify or they are starting to consolidate all these guidances. So it's starting to look a little bit neater. The biggest one now would be IFRS S1 and S2. So that's how you disclose sustainability risks and opportunities, as well as climate-related risks and opportunities, right? So all in all, adopting that ESG mindset, bringing them together has multiple benefits. I won't go through each and every single one. The slides will be shared with you afterwards. But there'll be a few areas that you may want to consider. First of all, number one, facilitate top-line growth. That's where you have your sustainable products that can be sold to customers. These can be seen as more ethical, more valuable to clients or to customers, and that may drive top-line growth. And then I also want to talk about number 4, because earlier on in the morning sessions, there was this conversation about balancing short-term profits versus long-term benefits, right? If we are looking at the time horizon of 25, 30 years, the board would say that they're going to retire anyway. Why do I need to bother to matter? And this is where the idea of adaptation comes in. Very heavily used in climate, but you can extend this idea out to other aspects as well. Adaptation is basically the practice of future-proofing ourselves, making sure that 20, 50, 70 years down the line, we have preparation for what is to come in this world, whether it's from the environmental perspective or from other perspectives. And I'll give you an example. So floods, right? Extreme weather, this is something that's very near and dear to most of us. We probably would have experienced this many times already. So adaptation means preparing for the future, let's say by various methods such as widening drainage systems or deepening your drainage systems. You may have monitoring mechanisms to make sure that things are in place. But if you think about it, for some organizations or some cities, that may not necessarily be the case. So I'll give you an example, and I believe this is an example from London. And they are also facing issues with floods within their city, and they know that 1 in 100 flood is going to become a 1 in 50-year flood in the next 10 to 15 years, right? The simple solution to that is to expand and build on the drainage infrastructure and network, right? But one issue that they picked up when they were reviewing the underground network for all these drainage systems is that next to those drains were telecommunication lines, were gas lines for your industrial or your commercial or residential cookers, as well as other key infrastructure like electricity and clean water. Which means if they want to expand the drain, they have to basically unroot the whole of London City, right? So that is the idea 20 years ago, that we are already prepared. This is built for a 1 in 100-year flood, but things have changed. And for the case in London City, of course, the adaptation would be weaker, right? But for most of us here, we may be just starting to think about our adaptation plans, right? We need to start thinking of these considerations, all the what-ifs of things that may happen in very near future, right? So this is the idea behind ESG, and if we go on to the next part, there are many people from different parts of the organization besides risk, IA, and sustainability. Some of you may be from finance, HR, legal. Each stakeholder has their own set of priorities and questions that they will ask when it comes to ESG, right? For the CRO, of course, it's simple. What are the ESG risks that I should prioritize and manage within my organization? For GC, which is the legal counsel, general counsel, they'll start thinking about the legal aspects. What's the rules and regulations that I need to adhere to when it comes to ESG? When it comes to HR, then I have to think about how am I going to change my hiring strategy to make sure that I still attract the right group of people. I'm seen as a sustainable and socially aware business. These are the questions that start to pop up, and you realize they are going in all sorts of directions and all sorts of priorities. So what's important and what's the gel behind this? We feel that enterprise risk management has evolved, and it plays a critical role in bringing those perspectives together, right? So for those who are not trained or involved in enterprise risk management, I thought I'll spend some time to just explain this, right? The standard definition that you will see in ISO 31000 would be that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And when we talk about objectives, this is where we start to break things down into the different parts, the different perspectives that you saw from the earlier slide, right? The CEO will be concerned about the strategic objectives. The CFO will look at the financial objectives. Many parts of the organization will look at the operational and the ESG objectives. So different areas, again, different priorities. But risk management tries to explain what will stop us from reaching all these. So it's important because we have seen organizations where every quarter update risk register, done. That's it. But the missing step here is to re-look it and re-link it back to what our objectives and KPIs actually are. That is critical in today's day and age, and this is something that we emphasize a lot to the projects that we are on these days. And what's more important is that risk management should always be seen as a proactive initiative and not a reactive initiative. If you start on the left-hand side, right, you have signals, you have signs, you have picked up something. Someone would say something, maybe things might go wrong in the next 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, we don't know. But we are aware that this may happen. There is a likelihood that something may occur, and that may result in a huge impact. So we want to deal with risk on the left-hand side, right? There is an opportunity for us to change the path or minimize the impact of the risk. But if we don't, then it becomes an issue. It becomes an issue, it becomes an incident, or worse, it becomes crisis. That means you have to divert all your resources in your normal day-to-day work just to deal with this one fire. Right? You have to activate key parts of your organization to do the firefighting, to respond to the media, to make sure everybody is okay, to deal with the insurance aspects, to calculate the loss after this. So if we are able to put in more effort on the left-hand side of that timeline, we have the opportunity to influence, which is why risk management, again, it is a consistent process that we should be very wary of. And I wanted to take this time to also talk about the risk topics. I realize it's a little bit harder to read, so I'm going to narrate some of the areas. So every year, Marsh and the World Economic Forum will partner up together to deliver what we call the Global Risk Report. So this Global Risk Report is actually a survey that we send out to about 15,000 professionals each year. So we are talking about not just CROs, we're also talking about CEOs, academics, ministers, politicians, researchers, doctors, so people who have a deep knowledge in their field, to ask them what they think the top risks are for the year. So this would be the result as of early 2024. The survey for 2025 has just completed. We will have the results in the next few months. But what you can see here, don't have to pay attention to the words, but pay attention to the color, right? A lot of greens and a lot of reds have dominated the risks profile of the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And that would involve environmental risks or social risks. So the loss of social cohesion, we're looking at climate change, weather events, extreme weather, climate action failure. Right? So this goes back to our earlier point. E factors, very relevant. S, also something to look at as well. And if we look at this year's results, So you would see two columns pop up, right? 2024, oops, so it doesn't show up here. Let's take a look. Are we able to go back to the previous slide? All right, great. So, I don't think we are able to show it here, but in terms of where the risk sits, it's again in the green or red zone, environmental and social risk. And in fact, four out of 5 top risks in the 10-year time frame would be focused on the environment. Social issues also feature heavily. So again, this comes back to the ESG conversations. It has become more relevant in these days. It's something that you cannot ignore. Again, traditional risk management, we are very used to doing things in a certain way, but it has to start to take in new aspects, just like how we take in AI risk management earlier this morning. Likewise, ESG is just as important. And the way that we do this, I would say, back to basics. This is the ISO 31000 risk management framework. For the risk practitioners here, you have definitely seen this many times across your career. And this would be the process that covers the key elements of risk management. Setting the scope, context, and criteria means understanding your objectives. If there's no understanding of objectives or strategy, then there's no understanding of the direction, right? And then when we go into the process itself, that's when we will identify, we will analyze, we will evaluate the situation. Later on, there will be a section on how we bring the concepts together, but just for now, understand that your core building blocks, your basic blocks of assessing risk, using it to portray risk on a heat map, reporting the risk to senior management and board, remains relevant. It remains relevant. But we will have to make some changes so that we evolve this to something just a little bit more. Okay? And then we talk about the 3 lines of defense. This is where internal controls and audit starts to come in. Right? First line of defense, that would be basically anyone that's on the ground, at the plants, at the factories. These are people who are involved in the day-to-day risk management. So they are the eyes and ears of the organization, the people that you have to work very closely with. Because they are the ones that are going to tell you, through risk registers or other channels, what may go wrong. For most of you here in the room, you will probably be sitting in the second line or the third line of defense. This is where we are more centralized. We bring the information together. And what's important in the second line is that we are not just providing the framework and the process, not just constant reminders to fill in the Excel spreadsheet. We are also providing advisory support to the first line of defense. It's a two-way street, you know. First line of defense would tell you that something may have gone wrong as part of their day-to-day operations. Remember, what's the objective of the plant manager, for example? Machines are running, making sure that the people come in on time, make sure they deliver the things as part of the production schedule. They will tell you any issue that may prevent the organization from reaching that objective. But from the second line's perspective, which is from most of you, you would be able to see, and also as part of your work, analyze what's around the organization. What has been happening in the world out there? Geopolitics is definitely number one. Supply chain disruptions was a huge issue during the COVID years with so many disruptions. With those perspectives and knowledge, you can also share those with the first line. If there is a supply chain disruption, do we have enough spare parts if something goes wrong? If there is geopolitical risk, are we still able to bring in the raw materials or the key ingredients for your product, right? So this is a two-way street and collaboration between the first and second line. Now what about the second and the third line then? In the traditional internal controls perspective, you would know that one key part of the IA process would be risk assessment, right? So reliance on what the risk management function has done as a sense check for organizations to know where they have to focus on. The third line provides the independent review. So they would look at all the documentation that's provided. They would have their own set of knowledge and testing procedures to make sure that the organization is protected at all times, right? So it is a harmony of stakeholders across the organization. We are not, or should I say, risk management is no longer a mailbox. It is a collaborative effort across all levels of the organization. And I wanted to share this slide because the work that Marsh in Strategic Risk Consulting has been doing 5 years ago is very different from what we see right now, 5 years later. In the past, when we think about risk management, the word silo comes out a lot. And what silo means is that each department manages their own risk. There's no interconnectivity between the different functions, and risk is operational. Most of the risks will be operational. I'm worried about a tire puncture. I'm worried about a hole in my machinery. I'm worried that somebody doesn't come in tomorrow and then the whole plant cannot run. 5 years later, as we speak to more of our clients or our partners, we realize that that's no longer the case. They start to ask questions like, hey, how do I include ERM in my key decisions? These are big decisions, investments, M&A. These are big areas where there is a lot of financial consequences if things don't go well. And these are the areas that we look at. That was a bit more on the dollars and cents perspective, but even more recently, the topics of social and governance or environment starts to pop up. How do we deal with the climate with our ERM framework? How do we make sure that there is diversity and inclusion within our ERM framework? These are questions that are popping up, and it takes into account the perspectives across the entire organization. And I would illustrate that very last point, perspectives from all parts of the organization, with this. ERM is the bridge to many parts of the organization. I've only drawn 4, but there's many more links that you can create. You will realize that most of the time, RM would work very closely, or you guys will work very closely with your colleagues who are doing insurance management. That's a very direct linkage between loss and claims. Sustainability for some of you, especially in areas where environmental risk, in companies where environmental risk is very high. Internal audit to support and to protect the organization. And in business continuity, we want to know what's the areas that may disrupt the business, fire, earthquake, tsunami, things like that. So ERM, the word E in ERM stands for enterprise. And that is the gel that brings the different departments or the different parts of the organization together. Again, this is just coming from a risk management perspective. If we start to draw the links from a strategic perspective, then pretty much you're linked up everywhere. Okay? So this will cover the ERM aspect. Then how do we bring this together? What are some of the key areas and some of the key tips that I can share with you? We have worked with organizations on such projects probably for about the last 2.5 years. There's a lot of projects concentrated in that time frame. Some organizations have run faster. They have started thinking about this 5 years ago. But we have seen some best practices and good tips that we think will be relevant for you. And the starting port of call would be the COSO ERM ESG framework. And this is the framework that's designed to help with looking at ERM with an ESG perspective. Some of you may be familiar with the COSO ERM framework. This is an evolution of that. So now it is the COSO ERM ESG framework. And this, I believe, is publicly available. It's by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, as well as COSO. And what COSO has done intentionally is to keep the principles and the components of this framework with the original ERM framework exactly the same. That means if you were to pull out 2 documents, you put them side by side, you will see each and every single one of these components. The naming is exactly the same. And what they wanted to emphasize with this is that you can build on your foundations within your ERM framework or your risk management program to extend this out to ESG. Of course, it is not a one-to-one match. It is not 100%, okay, I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to paste this for ESG. Not exactly. because we also need to consider other areas. And I have broken this down into governance, process, and culture. I think these tips hopefully will be very relevant to you as you bring this back to the organization. But I think what's important is that we start with the governance, right? How do we bring the teams together? In a usual organization, most of the time you will have a risk management function. For probably half of the clients that we see, they already have a sustainability function. For the other half, it's yet to be set up. But the important thing that we have to understand is how do the ERM team and the sustainability team collaborate together. The work that they do when it comes to ESG risk is slightly different. ERM brings together the information across the organization to support board reporting, to support risk-based decision making. Sustainability team may do a little bit more because they may also be involved in data collection. Maybe you're tracking certain emissions data, you may be estimating certain parts of your emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So there are slight differences. Do they need to come together as one single team? The answer that we have seen so far is no, because they have their important functions that they have to deliver separately. But what we want to see here is the close working relationship and the involvement of the risk managers or the sustainability managers in either parts of the operations. ERM team should coordinate and review the information, but for regular reviews, your workshops, your strategic risk planning, the sustainability team should sit in for these discussions as well. Because why? Because the sustainability team is going to rely on the ERM framework and the process to help to identify ESG risks and manage ESG risks. And as a matter of fact, when we review risk profiles for clients, we will see that almost 25% to 50% of their key risks would have an ESG aspect to it already. That means the foundations are already there. Things like supply chain management, ethical supply chain management, these are risks that are already considered as part of your supply chain risk. So the sustainability team needs to come in. They need to also review the enterprise risk profile to understand where are the aspects where sustainability we can contribute, right? And that is important for all of us. In terms of knowledge and training, sustainability team would also need to provide opportunities for knowledge sharing, because the understanding of ERM and ESG risk is slightly different. Hold that thought for a while, I'll explain to you why it's slightly different, right? But in terms of the processes, as mentioned, it is already, parts of it should already be embedded within your existing processes. When we do the integration for different organizations, the first step would be a maturity assessment. So we will look at how ready they are to bring these two topics together. That means they have the right culture, they have the right people, they have the right teams to bring the concepts together. And when we look at process, generally this is where organizations will do slightly better. Why? Because the ERM process, if you have been following COSO or ISO, will already cover key aspects of the risk. So you can see ESG strategy and risk identification and analysis, assessments of risk within ESG considerations. You are monitoring ESG. Many organizations don't know it yet, but they are monitoring ESG through key risk indicators already. So if you have key risk KRIs within your risk profile, have a look at them. See if you can map this out to ES or G factors. And then, of course, reporting. Reporting would be the idea of bringing information together. ERM is very good at that. So what are the differences? We talked about that, right? What are the differences between ESG and ERM that you need to take note of? Two things. There are many other areas, but I feel that these two would be critical. And that would be in the idea of time horizon and stakeholders. And I'll explain to you in just a bit why. Time horizon. When we look at the ERM risk profile, it is usually within a time frame of 3 to 5 years. Maybe even as short as 1 year. And the reason for that is because most strategic plans for organizations usually follow a 3 to 5 year cycle. Naturally, ERM will follow the same time frame, but once you start thinking about environmental risk especially, then you realize that that concept is very difficult to reconcile. And that's something that we also saw when we worked with different organizations. So what is different between ERM and ESG is actually the time frames that you're looking at. The way you manage risk in the next 365 days, it will be different to the way you manage risk in 3 to 5 years, which will be different in terms of how you manage risk for the next 15 years. For example, for floods, short term would be very responsive measures. How do you protect your people or your inventory or your products? In the medium term, it may be looking at monitoring how the trends in climate change will worsen flood risk, and we start to build a bit of infrastructure to protect ourselves. Long term would be looking at, as mentioned, adaptation measures, because something like widening a drainage system is not a 3-year thing. It's going to be a slow, gradual, but important process that takes place over years and years and years of effort. So time horizon is something that you may wish to consider when you are tweaking your ERM program to integrate ESG. And the other would be the idea of stakeholders, which is what we have talked about at length at the earlier part of this conversation. So that means understanding the interests of stakeholders. And I believe my next slide will show it better. Every stakeholder comes with a primary expectation. They have certain criteria or certain priorities that they wish to meet. As a customer, I only care about my product. As an employee, I care about my environment, my welfare, how much I'm being paid. To the public, if you are in an industry that requires a lot of emissions, you do a lot of emissions, then neighboring communities may be impacted by your business operations. And then authorities, not just environmental authorities, but regulatory authorities. The moment you hear the word compliance, the C word, then people will open their eyes and like, okay, I have to put in my resources for this. I have to do this. And when you think about it from a risk perspective, you realize that it is already embedded into what we do and the stakeholders that we are looking at, right? For example, for employees, we are making effort in terms of risk culture. We are driving up the awareness of raising issues to our superiors, to our managers, our team leaders. These are critical areas. Looking at, let's say, customers, product risk definitely will be within your risk profile. Because these are things that are part and parcel of your core business. You will definitely be thinking about what is the best product to give to the customers. And then eventually you will start thinking about the social causes, the environmental impact that you may have. So you can see the web starts to become more and more interconnected again. But if we were just to break this down and look at it neatly from stakeholder to stakeholder, then we will start to see actually everything comes together again. This would cover the internal audit aspect, right? There has been recent developments in terms of the controls needed for sustainability reporting. Some of you may have heard of the ICSR. So these are internal controls or requirements to support your sustainability disclosures. And again, if you were to look at the causal frameworks, it will always fall back to the same foundations. The ICSR framework was released, I believe, last year or the year before. It was published by COSO. But if we turn back the time 7 years back, COSO also published this internal controls framework. And again, the key components within the internal controls framework is exactly the same as the ICSR. Again, it's by intention. We want, or COSO wants, to set the right control environment. This is where you talk about integrity, you talk about the ethical values, the system of people within your organization when you are thinking about your control environment. Risk assessment sounds pretty familiar, right? This is your ERM process where you have to identify the right sets of risks. Again, we're not looking at rocket science or building a brand new framework or structure. We're going back to basics and our core foundations, even though we are looking at a new topic like sustainability or ESG. Your ERM framework will have that foundation to help do the risk assessment. Control activities, I'll go into a little bit more detail in the next slide, but this is also important because we all speak the language of risk. information and communication as well as monitoring activities. That is where we start to make sure that we move the information up and down the organization effectively. It's not just about spreadsheets again, it's also about awareness, training, it can be informal discussion, it can be formal controls that you put in place, and it is a collaborative environment to bring this together. But specifically on the control activities, ERM, ESG, IA, they are all underlined by the idea of risk. ESG, when we speak to organizations, they can articulate their ESG strategy confidently and very quickly. But when we ask them, so what's stopping you from achieving this strategy? Then there will be a pause. Because usually you think about the benefits and the opportunities, right? But if you were just to work backwards, go back to the definition of risk again, the effect of uncertainty on your objectives. You work backwards, you'll figure out what's going to stop you. And those are your risks. How do we make them better? We look at the mitigation. So these are the areas that we focus on to minimize the risk. And within mitigation, you have controls. And these, in the traditional sense of internal controls, are the actions that you take, the preventive, the detective, the responsive actions that you take. And what we see, and this is a finer detail, is that when you look at controls, documentation is actually very important. We have seen risk registers where controls are made out of 4 to 5 words, like repair, puncture of truck regularly, 5 words. But what it doesn't tell us is who is doing that repair. How often are the checks being done? Why is the control being performed? And what is this control trying to achieve? And why that is so important is because when your IA colleagues, or when you need to do a maturity review for your organization, you need to take a look at your internal controls. If not, areas of maturity reviews or testing will not be able to be done effectively. So it is an ecosystem that we see here. We started very broadly from concepts from ESG topics. We narrowed it down a little bit more into enterprise risk management frameworks, and now we start to look right into the detail. We're going straight into it on what kind of controls we are doing to deal with ESG related risks. I'm coming towards the end of the presentation, and I thought people or culture would be a fitting last slide to talk about. A lot of times when we do projects for clients, it generally requires a lot of effort, both from the consulting perspective as well as the sponsor of the project, to push through, to work with stakeholders, to partner and collaborate to ensure that everybody accepts or works together in risk management. What happens is when for people like us who complete the project and leave the project, we realize that when we go back to the same team 1 year later, they will say that, hey, the risk management process is not doing very well. After the project is completed, there was a drop-off, and then it's difficult for us to find the momentum to work effectively or convince stakeholders again. And a lot of time it falls back to the 7 factors that you see on this slide here, right? The keys to success in ensuring that we have a risk management framework that is effective across the entire organization. It evolves effectively to take in new concepts like ESG, AI, data analytics, things like that. First and foremost, tone from the top. Cannot emphasize this any further. Tone from the top would mean leadership, management, middle management, junior managers, walking the talk and having a culture where we can bring up risk or issues without the fear of getting into trouble, right? And then of course there are other aspects. I won't go into each one in detail, but you can see that we need to embrace ERM, ESG, IA from a people aspect as well. This is critical for success. Earlier on, you also heard speakers talking about implementing projects of huge scale. We are not here to tackle the world. It's very difficult for us to say, all right, tomorrow I'm going to set up a whole ERM framework, take in ESG, I'm going to automate it, digitalize it. Not going to work that way. our tip, or my tip for you is start small. Focus on a BU with high risk, or focus on a process with high risk, and then you can slowly implement the mechanisms. Whether it's key risk indicators, whether it's self-assessments, whether it's questionnaires, it is possible to start small, get your small wins, and then successfully convince your stakeholders that risk management is an effective tool to protect you and me across the organization. Okay? And before I finish off, one more point, right? We talked about all the pros, all the benefits of integrating all these concepts together. But there are also two very big cons. Two very big cons that I would like to close off with. It's probably not the cons that you're thinking of. You may be wondering after speaking for 60 minutes, this guy here is going to talk about the negatives of risk management. No, because these two cons should stay with you as part of your risk management journey. It needs to be continuous, that we are always taking in new information. We have to be aligned because you are as risk managers, you are providing expertise and advisory to all lines of defense, as well as your senior management and board. So you have to continue to put in the effort to ensure that this occurs. And then consistency also. Consistency in terms of the amount of effort that you put in, not just every quarter, but down the line. I would say that risk management is not a destination, but it is a journey that we should all go on, right? So I'll close it right at this point, but we're happy to take in any questions for the rest of the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Liu. Actually, I received 3 questions, and I'd like to thank you guys very much for those 3 questions. Actually, one of them, the 3 I want to know, to hear the answer for them. And one of them I was discussing in a side talk with Liu just a few minutes before the session, which is related to the KPIs. The first question is, he's saying that, he didn't mention the name, most of startup companies are still struggling with their business and financial risks. Can you give us some perspective how the ESG risks is also important and can impact the companies in their mid-term financially? I think what he meant here in this question, he want to sell the ESG framework to his management. And in order to sell it, he need to tell them how this can benefit them financially in the midterms. It's not just paying money, right, investing money. What is the return in the medium term? Right. Correct?
Okay, I see a few heads nodding, but I don't know who was the one that asked the question. But it's okay. So when it comes to smaller organizations or startups, again, back to the earlier tip that I shared, we are not trying to take on the entire world in one go. We want to make sure that the program or the framework that's implemented is basically aligned to the size and the speed of growth for the organization. There are larger frameworks for bigger organizations which can be expensive, can be time consuming. You may need many people to maintain the framework. But it doesn't mean that organizations with only one person looking after risk, or maybe one person who is double-hatting with another role, cannot do risk. It is still possible. And when we are looking at the ESG risk, it goes back to, again, the core of what makes ESG slightly different from ERM, which is knowing your stakeholders and knowing the time horizon. Short to mid-term, you may have certain requirements, expectations from your clients or your customers in terms of how you develop your product or your service. I use a bigger example, let's say in shipping. In the past, very straightforward. Pricing, cheapest and quickest, done. But in the last 2 years, since the supply chain issues and the climate change issues, companies are calling the shipping firms and they're asking, are you moving your product using sustainable fuels? Are you moving your product using sustainable fuels? And that is becoming a consideration because some companies are tracking their carbon emissions, right? So the expectation has been set for these certain group of customers. And we have to tweak that framework, the ESG ERM framework, to adapt to that. right? What can prevent us from actually producing this product? Is this a niche for us? Is this something that we can play in? Do we still rely on the traditional customer base? Or do we start to think about really the E&S, the ethical or the value generation considerations? So it is still doable as long as we consider these areas as well as link it back to the objectives.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Liu. The second question that we have is the one I said that I was discussing with you in the side talk before the session. It's saying that do you have any key metrics or indicators that the organization should use to measure the effectiveness of the integrated ESG and ERM and the internal controls framework?
Yeah, and I think we were having a very short discussion before the program actually started. So early on when we were discussing, we were talking about making sure you understand making sure stakeholders understand the core processes of risk management. Start with the identification, assessment, prioritization, mitigation, right? So a lot of organizations at the very fundamental level, they will start with making sure that stakeholders are submitting their risk reports on time. That's the base, right? You want to ensure that the information, risk information, flows into the second line regularly, as required by your policy or your procedures. And then the second thing, which is what we didn't get to discuss just now, would be then how do you link it to the key parts of your organization? An easy example I'll give is, let's say you're looking at an investment process or a project management, right? We will look at it from opportunities, we'll look at it from rate of return, we'll calculate the expected, the discounted cash flow for all these. These are usually done, but not all organizations will start thinking about risk, right? I need to hire, let's say I want to expand into another region. It's not just about the dollar and cents, it's also about the hiring, about the tax management. It's also about having the capabilities. It's also about having the right production line, the supply chain. So incorporating that into your existing decision-making processes will also be relevant. So the other KPI here is really, for the second line of defense, is really integrating this into management decisions. And then in terms of building culture, of course there are the traditional KPIs like setting up trainings, workshops, engagements with stakeholders. These are important as well. And of course, other processes like interviews with senior management or workshops with greater senior management, those are also relevant.
Okay. Questions are coming more and more.
That's good, that's good. Keep them coming.
So, the next question, what do you think the main difference between the G in ESG and the G in GRC? Is it possible to integrate them? If so, can you provide an example? Very, very good question.
Very good. Very specific question.
Yeah.
And my answer to that, the short answer to that is yes. The G in ESG is very, very close, or if not the same as the G in GRC. And the reason for that is we go back to the idea of governance. When we think of the word governance, not in an organizational perspective, let's say in a government perspective, governance, it means proper running of institutions, making sure that your agencies or your ministries are run well, people have trust in those agencies or institutions, and then making sure that the day-to-day work is being resolved. Any issues that a citizen may bring up should be resolved by that government institution, right? So that's good governance. So then what is good governance within the ESG context or the GRC context? It means that the systems that you are using, cyber, health and safety, environmental waste, pollution management, for example, these are run properly through the process of, let's say, setting up your internal controls, the policies and procedures to set what you can or cannot do when you are involved in this part of the business. Of course, there are other areas like hard controls, enforcement, penalties. If somebody does something wrong, you can also have the soft ways, which is basically building training, awareness, culture, right? So very similar topics. I hope you see them together in the same light. The idea again behind risk management is we want to keep things understandable, right? We want to be able to explain risk management to senior management, to board, to anybody on the street, and they can understand what we are doing.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about, does that mean ESG is part of risk management, which is broader, ESG or risk management, or if a company's ESG index is high, good ESG means it has carried out risk management? He means, what is the relation between the ESG rating and risk management? So if you have ESG rating high, does it mean that you are doing having effective risk management?
The consulting answer is it depends. But I'll explain to you why it depends. If you think of it as a Venn diagram, you have ESG and your ERM. It is not a full overlap. The core functions of ESG differ slightly from ERM, because ESG also looks at certain aspects as well. The more important areas are like data collection, talking or engaging with key stakeholders, and also executing certain parts of the ESG strategy. These are things that the ERM team may not necessarily do. Does a high ESG index score or rating mean high performance in risk management? The trend generally is yes. It is not a one-to-one match again, because within Marsh we also do ESG risk rating exercises for clients. Risk management is one component. I think it takes up about 10% of the overall score, right? So you can see it's not the full aspects of it. But if you go into different components, you realize that actually risk management is indirectly being mentioned, right? Do you have an environmental compliance policy? Do you have processes in place to make sure there's fair hiring, there's equitable pay for all? These are also indirect measures of how strong you mitigate your ESG-related risk, right? The impact's not direct, but usually if we see the organizations do strongly in the ESG or the ERM context, usually the reverse also starts to become true.
Okay. Question number 5. What is the role of the external auditor on sustainability report, as there will be standard reports on sustainability?
This would refer to the internal and external assurance for sustainability reporting, if I got that question correctly. So there are different levels of assurance. You have your limited assurance. I believe this is mentioned in ICSR or one of the EU guidelines. Limited assurance is usually looking at your internal teams reviewing the processes that you take to collect ESG data, to identify and to manage ESG risks. External auditors will have usually a higher threshold when it comes to these reviews, right? We start to talk about the very formal terms. If you have been part of a financial audit, you have heard things like materiality or internal controls over financial reporting. So the standard of the requirements required to meet these external auditor guidelines will be higher, right? So I think there is a difference. The internal one would usually be a slightly lower level of assurance.
Okay. Question number 6. Does there a need to be a separate risk register for ESG risks due to their medium and long-term time frames versus traditional risks?
We tend not to advise that, because then the convergence eventually becomes divergence. You want to have a unified risk register to collect all this information. There are many ways around this. We have proposed different solutions depending on how critical ESG is to the organization. Let's say if you are in a sector with high emissions, right? You may want to have a separate tab, let's say in your spreadsheet, to selectively highlight or pull out certain ESG risks. You have organizations who have very little scope 1, scope 2 direct emissions. They are all in the scope 3 area. They may just add a simple column, mapping this risk to my ESG factors, or mapping this risk to my stakeholders, right? So we want a case where it's looked together with other aspects of risk management. Again, I go back to the idea of supply chain risk. I'm very confident that most, if not all of you here, would be recognizing supply chain risk within your profile, within either your enterprise or your department level risk profile. Within supply chain risk management, you start to think about choosing the right suppliers for your products and inventory. And then if you break it down further, then ESG comes in again, isn't it? Right? You want to source for products that are produced with human rights, without human rights issues. You want to source for products where it's produced ethically. So this sits as part of a wider web of supply chain risk. So you can see the integration starting to come in. It's a little bit of a challenge when you're just starting out, because all you see are enterprise risks. But as you slowly analyze each of them, what are the components within each of your risks, you will start to see where the ESG factors come in. And I think that's important. We want to keep them together rather than pulling them out separately.
And I want to just elaborate on this in two very quick statements. Having multiple risk registers in your organization is a fatal mistake. You need always to have a single source of truth. Single source of truth, structured and customized to fit your organization. Having multiple risk registers will result in inconsistency, misalignment, and a reduction in the risk culture level. Okay? Thank you. The next question is, it mentioned before that ESG promotes the equal among people, profit, planet. My question is, how to make it equal? In fact, company is impossible to take care planet and people without having profit.
The honest answer is that profit is still probably top of mind for most of the organizations today, isn't it? The three areas we talked about, people, profit, and planet, it began before the rise of sustainability, the reports to the United Nations in the 50s and the 60s. If you were to talk about planet or saving the environment, it probably would be laughed at, because the key function of a company, and this was defined, I think, within the US, is to generate returns for shareholders. That's the fundamental thing that has been the case for many, many years. It's only in recent times, in the last few decades, where we start to see other aspects pull out. Can people or planet issues outweigh profit in the future? Probably not. But I feel that it will reach a point where at least these areas are equal, and we start to consider them beyond a compliance perspective. What's helpful now is that within the world today, there's a lot of regulations that's being slowly pushed out regarding climate, reporting, human rights, workers' rights. And that is just the first push. But the second push comes in usually when when the world faces an existential crisis, right? Before COVID hit, ask yourself honestly, when you prepare your business continuity plan for a pandemic, how long do you prepare it for? 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 months? 3 months was how long SARS lasted, right? But COVID didn't last for 3 months, it lasted for 2 years, right? Even longer in some countries. So when the human society is pushed up against the wall, sorry, this is a bit philosophical, but the human society is pushed up against the wall, then that's when innovation comes in, right? People would have to innovate, or then if not, they will face the severe consequences. So I do feel that the equality is not there yet between the three Ps, but eventually I do see a path towards that direction.
Okay, thank you. And I only have less than 5 minutes right now, so we might not be able to finish all the questions is increasing.
There's a lot of questions.
So why do we need to have, why do we need to approach ESG and ERM as two separate frameworks that converge instead of simplifying ESG as part of the risk universe that needs to be assessed by the ERM framework? So sustainability would be the objective and ERM is the management tool.
It can be done that way. It is possible to do it that way because the outcomes of the convergence, controls, risk, ESG, is meant to make sure that the organization remains adequately resilient when something goes wrong. Whether or not you're preventing something from happening, you're monitoring something, or you're detecting something. Why we put ERM as the core, and then ESG probably has its own things to do, but we pull in parts of it within ERM, is because we want to make sure we are utilizing our available resources and frameworks, right? If we try to have either complete two different sets of frameworks, or we tell stakeholders, hey, you know, this is the ESG way of doing things to identify risk, then you have two paths that you're taking when it comes to risk management. We want to keep things, again, resource friendly. Risk management sometimes is not adequately budgeted or resourced in some organizations, unfortunately. So we want to make sure that the considerations in that regard is there. We leverage on what we have, which is why in terms of the global standards, they have designed it intentionally that the components that you see from the 2013 version to the 2020 version to the 2024 version are the same, because the idea and the message they want to give is go back to your basic building blocks and build from there. And that's where we will have a lot of value. And I think just one last thing for me, because I think we're running out of time, how we perceive risk management. I want to use this analogy to close off today's session, right? Think of the organization as someone driving a car down the road, right? Think of the organization as someone driving the car down the road. 10 years ago, if you were to ask someone, where does risk management belong within that car? They'll tell you that risk management will be the brakes, right? We don't want to go too fast, we don't want to crash, we are the brakes, right? But today I hope to change that mindset. ERM, risk management, whatever you want to call it, is not the brakes. It is the foot that controls the brake or the accelerator, right? We are not here to stop the car. We are not here to stop you from achieving your objectives or your strategic targets, KPIs or bonuses. But we are here to regulate that speed so that you are driving safely on that road and you can still make it to the destination on time.
Okay, thank you so much. I still have 3 questions from RD, Tawfiq, and Emmy, but unfortunately we are not able to take them now. So, but Mr. Liu is here. You can grab him aside and take all the questions that you want. Okay? Thank you so much.
Check, okay. Thank you so much, Mustafa. And thank you so much, Mr. Lee Suyun, for the great session. So we have our little token of appreciation for our speaker today. So, Mr. Mustafa can give our little token of appreciation. Please give them a round of applause. So, from your MAPA? Okay. So we have another token of appreciation for Mr. Liu Shuyan from your MAPA. Okay, thank you so much, Mustafa and Liu Shuyan. So we will have a short comfort break for 15 minutes. We will continue to the next session with Mr. Fajar Proboseno. So we will be back at 3:15. Please be prepared here in 3:15 because we will continue to this next session. Thank you.
Welcome to Enterprise Risk Management Academy, IRMA, where we empower professionals to discover possibilities and make better, risk-informed decisions. We believe that effective leadership is not just about managing risk, but about making the right decisions when navigating the complexities of this uncertain world. Our multi-tiered certification journey is designed to equip you with the knowledge and tools to address multifaceted challenges. Whether you're starting with the Certified in Risk Essentials, CRE, advancing to the ERM Associate Professional, IRMA, achieving the ERM Certified Professional, ERMCP, or mastering governance with the Certified in Enterprise Risk Governance, CERG, each step empowers you to turn risks into opportunities. Our vision is to spread risk literacy, empowering individuals and organizations worldwide. Because when you truly understand enterprise risk management, you will gain a new horizon, enabling you to make better decisions, take calculated risks, and lead with confidence. Start your journey, leap into new opportunities, and lead with better decision-making with IRMA.